We need to use this time to think. We're not going back. But where are we going? What do we want for our planet, our communities, our future? If we don't answer this question, it will be answered for us, and blame shifted from the powerful to the powerless. We need each other now. We need to reflect and reset, strategize, organize, assemble, collective power. This is a network. Join, claim the future.
Hi, let me say hello to everybody. My name is John McDonnnell, and let me introduce you to Claim the Future. Many of you, I'm sure, will have participated in some of the activities we've organized over the last year. Claim the Future was set up at the beginning of the pandemic to discuss some of the issues that we were facing as a community then, and then what sort of policies we wanted to react to the immediate challenges of the pandemic, but also to have a discussion about the sort of society that we wanted to create as we came through the pandemic itself. We brought together a whole range of policy experts, think tanks, campaigners on a whole range of issues. We set up, it was about 20 panels. They met, they discussed, it was all online, huge attendances at some of those discussions. They then published a series of papers, and we put them up on the Claim the Future website and brought them together in a summary form in a pamphlet that is also on the website itself. So by all the means, go to the website, Claim the Future, and you can see the sort of policy ideas that came up in those discussions. The key issue for most of us was not just to have a discussion, but actually to support each other in campaigning. So where there was an issue, making sure that we thoroughly researched it, identified who was working on that particular issue, who was campaigning for change and the policies that we wanted to see, and then try and give out as much support as we possibly could. And then where there are issues that had come up during those discussions where we felt there was a need for a campaign, well, we brought people together to do that. So the whole idea was of making sure we had a good analysis of our society, a good discussion of what sort of society we wanted to create as we went through the pandemic itself, and then how we could campaign for that, the creation of that society through the development of a fairly clear-cut policy program. I just want to thank everyone who was involved in that. It was literally hundreds of people coming together. What we've also done is that we've brought people together at different stages when there's been issues that we felt needed to be discussed, and really to see what sort of ideas there were out there for the future. So that's why we've had a couple of discussions already about in the run-up to this week's budget, about the sort of issues that people were facing within society and the sort of policies that we wanted to see within that budget. And some of you may recall we had a seminar discussion around issues around debt, but also around the need for radical change in terms of public service delivery, particular social care. What we thought we'd do as well is, once the budget was out there, to have a sort of discussion around the budget, post-mortem, of course, of what was in it, but also where we go from here, because there are some really big issues. Most of us were hoping that this would be, as it was trailed, a big budget, a significant budget. I have to say, there's been a fair amount of disappointment about that. In fact, even though the opinion polls I see today have been largely supportive of some of the initiatives that the Chancellor has brought forward, and there's been a bit of a bounce for the Conservative Party in the latest poll this evening. Nevertheless, when we look at the budget in a bit more detail, I have to say it's extremely disappointing and quite retrograde in some respects. I always have a sort of dictum for a budget. So the louder the applause on the first 24 hours, usually the bigger the disappointment there is by the weekend. And I think that might well be the case in this instance. Just to run through some of the issues then that came up, just as background, which I think were particularly disappointing. We heard a lot about the tax proposals that the Chancellor was bringing forward in terms of increasing corporation tax. And we were hoping that there might well be redistributive form of budget this time round, which would tackle some of the grotesque levels of poverty and inequality that we have within our society. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The Chancellor made a big point in his introductory speech to the budget that he was going to level with the nation, that he would be honest and straight with them about telling them how it was and what he was doing. Well, unfortunately, on one issue, with regard to taxation, there was a sort of a stealth tax introduced, which is a freezing of the tax thresholds, and that means for the lower paid there will be a tax increase next year. Alongside that, we welcome the fact that the furlough scheme has been extended. It's a pity it wasn't announced months ago, because with the insecurity of the announcement around the furlough scheme, when it would happen, jobs have been lost. But it's been extended, but it's still limited in time, and it's unconditional. And again, the grants that have gone to support companies on the furlough schemes in the last year have had no conditions attached to them, and that's resulted actually in the furlough scheme resources being used to introduce policies by management of fire and rehire. And we've had quite a large range of examples now. It's almost infected the employment relations in this country, where companies have fired their staff and only rehired them after cuts in wages and undermining conditions. Everyone was pleased that the Chancellor extended the £20 additional money for universal credit, but there's still a cut-off, a cliff edge at the end of September, which means people will be worried about what then happens, because universal credit is so low anyway. But the legacy benefits, those people on legacy benefits, largely disabled people, have never had the additional £20. And again, that wasn't addressed in the budget this time. They got nothing. We've supported the campaign of the excluded, who have not had any support from the government other than universal credit. The ones who, last year, we raised the fact that there were 3 million people excluded from the self-employed support scheme. All of those people who are freelancers and others. The Chancellor moved a bit, but there's still over 2 million that are still excluded from that sort of support. On the taxes on business, it was interesting that in addition to the announcement of the corporation tax introduced in 2023, the Chancellor did bring forward a whole range of different tax allowances and tax reliefs. The super relief he brought forward was 130% of tax relief for the investment being introduced by any individual company. The problem that we've seen on that time and time again is that tax reliefs, and there are an abundance of them, and we were looking at a review of them only 18 months ago, many of the tax reliefs open up the opportunity to behavior which, to be frank, almost edges on onto tax avoidance, rather than using the tax relief for what was originally provided for. Again, there are real issues that people have raised today around tax avoidance. The government is now set on introducing free ports. And for the advice on that, that's calm, is the free ports themselves actually don't necessarily create jobs. They suck in jobs from elsewhere, but they have been areas in which there's been significant tax avoidance exercises undertaken. So again, a real worry. The other issue I thought, which was a bit of an affront that hasn't really been picked up on much within the media analysis of the budget, is that the government is introducing a review of the bank surcharge. And if you remember, the bank surcharge was introduced after the banking crash in 2007, 2008, as a way in which the banks themselves could pay back some of the, help pay for the consequences of the crisis that they created. The corporation tax worry for most is that timetable for 2023. And again, the gossip and rumour in the political rumour mill is that actually this government might not introduce the corporation tax rises and have a general election in 2023. So they might really just be a sop rather than a reality. The worst elements of the budget, I'm afraid, were the austerity continues. I think that's a member of my family just peeping around the door to see if I'm still here. But anyway, austerity continues. A pay freeze for public sector workers, Cuts are returning. The 10 billion announced in November, another 5 billion announced in this budget, but there's a calculation of about 30 billion overall. And the green investment that we were hoping for, yes, the Chancellor has taken one of Labour's ideas, one of the ideas I put forward of a National Investment Bank, but has significantly underfunded it. And the green investment that has been brought forward is nowhere near the scale that's required. And yet again, sounds like more re-announcements of what we've heard in the past. And I have to say there's a fair amount of anger that's been produced today about the levelling up grants that the government has introduced, where again, these are meant to be in support for areas that have gone through largely industrial decline and require additional funds to get their economy, I think, restructured for the future. Again, it looks as though a lot of that money has gone into Conservative MPs' seats, so political decisions are made rather than rational economic ones. And on the final point, I suppose, Joseph Rowntree Trust today looked at the issues around inequality and rising poverty, and the analysis was another 500,000 people dropping into poverty as a result of this budget. So overall, to be frank, extreme disappointment, and in some instances as well, quite a lot of anguish that this budget never really lived up to what we really needed. And although there were big numbers announced at different stages in the budget, unfortunately, it doesn't seem as though those big numbers will impact upon tackling some of the real issues that we face, both in terms of our public services, the demands on the NHS, particularly placed by COVID, social care, which we've, in this crisis, we've only survived with the support of the workers within social care, underpaid workers, but it has exposed the underinvestment and lack of control, democratic control of social care, and the need for a national social care service, but that was not even addressed in the budget yet. And to be faced with another round of pay freezes, cuts in public services, all those commitments that were given by the Prime Minister that austerity was at an end, I'm afraid have proved to be unfounded. However, that's the situation 24 hours after the budget itself, and we'll see more analysis by the weekend and in the budget debate over the next few days in Parliament, into next week in Parliament when the finance bill comes forward. There'll be a number of us who are trying to introduce amendments that at least seek to protect those on the lowest level of income and ensure that we have some protections as well about the investment within our public services. The analysis of the government was that, I suppose, in some respects, it was, of course, the focus on the COVID crisis and the pandemic and how we get through it. And everyone is so grateful for the rollout of the vaccination so successfully as a result of the work of the NHS staff and the public sector workers that are overall coordinating all of that. And there's a feeling that maybe as we come through the pandemic that there will be, I suppose, the pent-up demand within the economy will enable the economy to recover. But it's about the nature of that recovery. If we're going to recover and just go back to the maldistribution of resources and incomes within our society, we'll still be faced with these extremes of inequality, and we'll still be faced with large numbers of people in poverty, living in overcrowded, in sanitary conditions, and as we saw from the statistics 2 weeks ago, a doubling of those that are living in destitution at the moment. So the fear is that even as we come through this recovery, even if we do come through the pandemic and there's an economic recovery based upon unleashed demand, unfortunately, it will not impact upon the problems that have been with us for at least the last decade of inequality and poverty and the rundown of our public services. But the other issue as well that I think people were looking to the budget yesterday for was recognizing as we come through the pandemic, we'll be faced with an existential crisis, an existential threat of climate change, and that the action needed to tackle that has to be at scale, and it has to be, well, immediate. And there didn't seem to be that sense of urgency yesterday in the budget, particularly as the government froze fuel prices once again and is now investing in a coal mine. So again, it's one of those issues that we'll be seeking to highlight and campaign over this coming period. Again, it is about what sort of society do we want to create and how do we go about creating that. So one of the roles that Claim the Future we'll all do, have been participating in it, is have those debates, have those discussions and support the campaigns. One of the issues I've raised all the way through the discussion of the presentation I made is the issue around inequality. And again, the disappointment yesterday was there didn't seem to be even an acknowledgement of the levels of inequality within our society when the Chancellor made his budget statement or in the debate afterwards. So that's one of the issues that we're going to be pressing in this coming period in every way we possibly can. So I'm really pleased that our first speaker this evening is Kate Pickett. Most of you will know Kate. She's an epidemiologist and political activist. She's Professor of Epidemiology in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York. But you'll know her because she co-authored with Richard Wilkinson the Spirit Level. And it's Spirit Level, Why More Equal Society Almost Do Better. And she's co-founded the Equality Trust. The Spirit Level, when it came out, I think reshaped a lot of the debate around equality within our society, and actually not just exposed what we were facing in our society and shamed us actually, but also gave us an indication on the way forward. So Kate.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for the introduction, and good evening, everybody. If you go back to sort of a year ago or further back, when I got introduced as an epidemiologist, I think a lot of times people didn't quite know what that meant, and I was often labelled as an economist. You'll get to one of those later. But this year, everybody does know what an epidemiologist is, actually, because we've had epidemiologists on our TV screens every night, giving scientific advice to the government about how to cope with the pandemic. Now, I'm not that kind of epidemiologist. Those infectious disease epidemiologists who've been advising the government all the way through have done a really good job, I think, on providing good evidence and good support to the government, even if their recommendations haven't always been taken up. But I'm a social epidemiologist, and that means I'm interested in the social determinants of health and the causes of health inequalities. So I thought I'd share with you what I've been doing during the course of the pandemic as an epidemiologist, because it relates to how we view that budget that came out yesterday. So I've been doing a couple of things, and the first is I've been working within a COVID-19 scientific advisory group for the district of Bradford and Airedale. And for those of you who don't know, and any international listeners we might have, Bradford is a post-industrial city in the north of England with high levels of deprivation and poverty, a very large ethnic minority population, mostly of Pakistani origin. And it's where we're doing a lot of great studies, great epidemiological studies, primarily following children. We have a big study called Born in Bradford, and we've been watching children go up and try to figure out how they're doing in that context. But when the pandemic hit, we were asked to form a COVID-19 scientific advisory group for the local district to advise them on how they responded to COVID-19 and how they might think about recovery afterwards. And so I've spent the last year within that group doing research on the impact of the pandemic on the lives of families and other people in Bradford. And we've not really been focused on who's been infected, who's been ill, death rates and things like that. We've been interested in what it's meant to experience lockdown, what it's been like for people to be on furlough or to have lost their jobs, what it's been like to have children home from school and be trying to homeschool. And the impacts of COVID have been really profound. We've been doing surveys of people through the year. We've been talking to people and just picking up a huge amount of distress, of anxiety, and of worries. We have seen a major increase in mental illness, and that's something that's going to outlast the pandemic and need support and need mitigation. We've seen huge anxieties, a large degree of depression, and that's been in children as well as among adults. We've seen people sort of stuck within their homes and isolated. We've seen rises in domestic violence. We've seen rises in child neglect and the number of children needing that kind of intervention. But mostly, I think what we've been picking up is that economic impact. So in the UK, I think we've all been hugely grateful for the furlough scheme. And I think, very pleased that has been extended for another 6 months in yesterday's budget. But furlough sounds great, but it isn't always quite enough. We've had a problem of low pay in this country for a long time. Bradford is a city where a lot of people are on low pay. And what we found was that people who had been furloughed throughout the pandemic were really suffering financially. They'd been getting by before, just about, and on furlough, they were getting 80% of what they'd been earning. Well, 80% of just enough isn't enough. And that deficit in families' incomes over that long period through the year has been a real hardship. So if normally you're just about able to pay your bills, just about able to avoid using high interest credit or getting into debt, suddenly you're no longer able to manage. And those worries, those anxieties of debt, of falling behind on rent and normal bills, those have been a reality for families throughout the past year. We've been, concerned that people would lose their homes. Homelessness is on the rise, and we didn't see an extension to the eviction ban in yesterday's budget either. So that ban is due to end at the end of March, and it wasn't extended yesterday. There will be families being made homeless. There will be a huge rise in destitution, in poverty, in homelessness. We've been looking at children throughout the year and seeing the impact of being at home, missing a whole year of education, some kids. And for the poorest kids, they've missed the most. They've been in houses where there isn't the digital technology to allow them to stay connected to what's going on at school. They've been in houses where there isn't the capacity or the time of adults to support their education, as there is for middle class kids. And so educational inequalities growing over that year. And the thought of what that is going to mean to our children and young people growing up is a real worry. So the other thing I've been doing over the past 6 months is I've been chairing a commission in Greater Manchester. And again, for listeners who might not know, Greater Manchester is a city region in the north of England. It's big. It's 2.8 or 9 million people. It's got a large economy, and it encompasses several towns and 10 local authorities. And Greater Manchester set up an independent inequalities commission to take a real hard look at existing inequalities in Greater Manchester, advise them on the impact of COVID on those inequalities, and help them think about how they might build back better. So that's what I've spent the last 6 months doing. And a lot of that time has been listening to people's concerns about how inequalities are affecting their lives, whether those are ethnic inequalities, gender inequalities, inequalities related to the places they live in, inequalities related to disabilities, as well as inequalities related to pay and wealth and power. And I think the message that came through most was a really strong sense of frustration at having tried to say so often how much inequalities are affecting their lives, and having tried to make their case again and again, and feeling that sometimes they're heard and then nothing changes. And after a decade of austerity, I think it feels to a lot of campaigners, to a lot of people with lived experience, to a lot of people trying to create change in their communities, that they've been banging their head against a brick wall, and that there's just been no prospect of things changing. And of course, what we were hoping for with yesterday's budget was that we might finally see a recognition of how deeply damaging the inequalities that existed in our society before COVID were, how much they added to the impact of COVID, so that we've had, you know, the highest death rate among the rich countries, and you know, we've had a harder economic hit from COVID as well. We were all hoping for a sort of post-war 1945 moment, a recognition that things really needed to change and that somebody would finally listen, and that's of course not what we've got. And it is devastating to think about the impact of a decade of austerity being compounded by a lack of attention to trying to build back better, and a real lack of investment in the future. This is a budget that's just reacting to the here and now. There's really nothing in there about investing for the long-term future of our country. Those levelling up grants, it's not surprising to me, I think, that those have gone to towns and cities where there are Conservative MPs. We saw exactly the same thing with the austerity cuts that started in 2010. The largest cuts were made in areas that had the highest proportions of child poverty. And if you look at graphs of child poverty against austerity cuts to local authorities, you've got a really strong correlation. And then if you coloured in the local authorities that were Conservative-led, and coloured them in blue, and then coloured red those that were Labour-led, you could see that those highest cuts were all to those Labour-led local authorities. So this is nothing new, this picture, but it is a disappointment to feel that we've not seen the commitment to change that we needed. I'll finish with sort of one last thought before we go on to the next speaker and hear from Joe. But all through the year, we have heard the government say that they are listening to the science, that they're being led by the science in their reaction and actions related to the pandemic. And all year I've wanted to say, why haven't you listened to the science and the social science for the past 4 decades that has been telling you the devastating impact of inequality in our country? Why 4 decades since we had our first government commissioned report on health inequalities, and still those health inequalities are there and they're growing? Why has it taken so long, you know, for even there to be a recognition that science ought to be feeding in this way into government policy? So we were hoping for change. Everybody talked about this as a pivotal moment, but the one thing that budget has done is that it has not pivoted an inch. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks. We'll come back on questions if that's okay. I'd like to know more about the Manchester Commission as well, and what's happening at the local level on some of these issues, where local authorities and others have come together to look at what's happening within their communities. We'll come back to that in questions, that's okay. Our next speaker, people know he's been involved in many of our discussions in recent years about where we go from here in terms of economies, both here and globally. It's Joseph Stiglitz. Joe, I'll do your blurb if that's okay. Otherwise, I'll get told off. Joseph Stiglitz is a Nobel laureate in economics, professor at Columbia University, chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. And I've got written here, and it's absolutely true, recognized around the world as the leading economist. He's written textbooks that have been translated in more than a dozen languages, actually more. And his latest book is Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited, Anti-Globalisation in the Era of Trump. Most of us have actually used Joe's work in debate after debate, discussion after discussion, to stimulate the debate and discussion and provide that alternative that we desperately need. Joe, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And Kate has done a fantastic job of giving, you might say, concrete feeling for some of the issues I'm going to raise. We talk a lot about in the United States a K-shaped recovery in which, and we talk a lot about how the pandemic has really adversely affected those at the bottom. The virus is not an equal opportunity virus. It goes after those at the bottom. And Kate has described, I think, very vividly the very many ways in which the pandemic has exposed and exacerbated the inequalities in our societies. What I want to do is take a very high level look at some of the issues, macroeconomic, and pick up some of the issues raised by the budget yesterday. But I'm going to do it for the most part in a broader global context, talking about what the situation in the UK, but also that in the US and in Europe. And in some ways, assessing what's happening in the UK in comparison with what is going on elsewhere. Before going into some of these details, I think it's probably worth spending a moment claiming victory, at least a rhetorical victory, that no one in the United States, Europe, UK is openly advocating austerity. I think the lessons that austerity did not produce the benefits that were claimed of it and caused enormous devastation is widely recognized. And so austerity is not a popular word. So that's almost been banished from the vocabulary of governments. I think that's a good thing that at least the language has changed in a very important way. I think the pandemic has also illustrated the role of government. In many ways, we've had what economists and social scientists would call a natural experiment, where we've seen the pandemic has affected many, many countries around the world, and some have done better, some have done worse. And one of the things that we've seen is that those countries with competent, strong governments have done better. New Zealand, South Korea have been two of the countries that have done well, Taiwan. And then you look at those who have done really badly, Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro in Brazil. You can make a list, and it's at least correlated with kinds of governments that are authoritarian, undemocratic, don't trust science, and are engaged in dividing society. The pandemic has also exposed, shown the importance of social insurance and a good public health care system. One of the reasons the United States has been so adversely affected is the disease goes after those at the bottom with poor health conditions, and health disparities in the United States are larger than in other countries, and health status is lower than in other advanced countries, precisely because we haven't recognized access to healthcare as a basic human right. But broader issues of social insurance have also shown to be important. We don't have mandatory health insurance. We don't have mandatory sick leave. And The US and I think UK are one of the few countries and backed countries that don't have that. And that means that people who are sick with COVID-19, if they can go to work and they're at the bottom half of the population living hand to mouth, they do go to work. And that helps spread the disease. So we paid a very high cost for society in not having this mandatory sick leave. An interesting thing in the United States really illustrates the selfishness of many of our corporate leaders is that Congress passed a law requiring mandatory sick leave just for COVID-19. But then the largest and richest companies lobbied that they should be exempt. And so close to 50% of all jobs were exempted from this. And you also know that, as you must know, that these large companies have been lobbying against the $15 an hour minimum wage, that the minimum wage in the United States, adjusted for inflation, is roughly at the same level that it was 65 years ago. Finally, the pandemic has illustrated one of the things that climate change also illustrates, the importance in our society of externalities. And I mention that because it's another reason that important aspect of the government. You need to regulate externalities. You have to take actions when one individual has adverse effects on others. So in many, many ways, the pandemic has brought home the importance of all of these things which are at the core of the appropriate balance between markets and government that has been lost in the era of neoliberalism, beginning with Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the United States, but unfortunately has not yet been restored. Well, I emphasize that we ought to be celebrating the victory, at least of our having won the intellectual war of what is important. I hasten to add that it's only a rhetorical victory. And I think what's happened in the budget of the UK is similar to what's happening in the United States, that when you look at concrete measures, and budgets are a way you translate rhetoric into reality, you see the gap between the two, you realize that there is more rhetoric than conviction in the United States, I'd say, in the part of the Republicans. So, for instance, in the United States, there is having suspended concerns about budget deficits during the entire administration of President Trump, having voted for tax cuts for the billionaires and corporations, leading to trillion-dollar deficits, all of a sudden they're talking about fiscal religion, worried about the deficit. Now, and the same thing, everybody recognizes today the importance of science. We wouldn't have had, without good science, we would not have been able to figure out what is causing all these deaths, figure out a vaccine. But yet, the Republicans, President Trump, put forward budgets calling for 30% cuts in the science budget every year. So let me proceed very quickly, because my time is limited, to 3 points, and I'll cover them very briefly. One, some few remarks about the pandemic, about the budget details. Secondly, some few remarks about claim the future, about going forward. And the third is some few remarks about broader budgetary principles that have been highlighted by the pandemic. The first, in terms of budget priorities, The pandemic has illustrated, as I said before, the importance of health and social insurance. Those are areas that should have been expanded with a commitment to the public health service. A second thing is protecting the vulnerable. And as Kate emphasized, the issue of homelessness that may arise. The fact that those at the bottom of the population have actually gotten more in debt. And the stay in eviction doesn't solve the problem. It just means that they owe more and more. And when the stay is ended, there's a real problem, will be a real problem with homelessness. So this is an issue that all the countries that have announced these temporary eviction stays need to address. And I'm afraid that even in the United States under Biden, we haven't adequately dealt with the issue. A third aspect of the budget that's really important is it needs to be comprehensive. And there are a couple of aspects of that I want to emphasize. And as part of Biden, we want to make sure that children can go back to school safely. And the interruption in school has been particularly harsh on those at the bottom. But that means the schools have to be retrofitted. And the good thing about the Biden budget is providing billions of dollars for that. And that should have been a bigger part of the budget yesterday. A second important thing is to realize how important local bodies are in the United States, states and localities, and your local authorities. And this is a time in which they need more support, not withdrawing support. And that's part of the dishonesty, you might say, of the Republican Party and some of the dishonesty that is going on now in the UK. Cutting back support for local authorities or not expanding it in ways that are needed is either forcing them to raise rates or cutting back services which go disproportionately to the poor. So it's a regressive measure, hidden because people don't really trace out the full effects. It actually has a macroeconomic effect. The consequences of not helping the states and localities in the United States was that there was a decrease in employment. And we didn't, even by 2019, in the United States, we had not gotten back to the level of state and local government employment that we had before the 2008 crisis. And that was one of the reasons why the employment GDP labor force population ratio did not get to the level that it should have. In one way, the announcement that there would be a increase in corporate income tax in 2023 is a good thing in that it is a part of a global movement, I think, to increase global corporate taxes. Remember, these are pure profits taxes, rent taxes. Do not discourage investment because labor is deductible, capital costs are deductible. It is really a tax on pure profits, or nearly so. The point that John raised is that you can promise anything in the future, and it really wouldn't, you don't know whether it will be executed. But still, it's important, at least for helping the United States, because it will help the United States in our decision in the next round of discussions to raise our corporate income tax from 21% to hopefully to 25% or even possibly higher. The there were many points that John raised that echoed so much of what happened in the United States. For instance, in terms of many of the programs that we extended in December and need to extend again under the new Biden proposal should have been done much earlier. And because they weren't done much earlier, the economics has not been as good as it otherwise would have been. But one of the points I want to emphasize is that the UK has performed much, much worse than the United States and worse than Europe. You have to ask the question, why did UK perform so much more poorly than the United States? And the same thing for Europe. And I think part of the reason was that particularly the Democrats pushed a very strong budgetary response. It was a bazooka. It was not well designed, not as well designed as many of the provisions in European countries. But the magnitude of the support really made a difference and helped the United States minimize the damage in the United States. Final couple points. I think there is scope to the extent that one wants to begin to focus on, you might call it budget consolidation, reducing the deficit. The way to do it is increase digital taxes, environmental taxes, corporate income taxes now, a windfall profits tax. Some companies have done very well. All of these are things that could be done as the first priority, especially once growth is restored, for those who are concerned about the budget stance. Let me then in the next couple minutes talk about some very broad budget principles. Going forward, building back better, or reset as you sometimes use the word in the UK, is really important. And when we think of the agenda going forward, there are two things that you've already emphasized: the importance of climate change and the importance of moving towards a more egalitarian society. There's one or two more things that I want to emphasize. We are going to be moving to a more knowledge-based economy. We're going to be moving, there's going to be a lot of restructuring. The part of building back better is there's an important role of government in promoting that economic restructuring. All of this means is that the money that we spend has to do double or triple duty. I did some work with Cameron Hepburn, Nick Stern, and their colleagues at Oxford, showing that, in fact, there are many, many projects that actually accomplish all of these things simultaneously, have high multipliers, you get a lot of bang for the buck, and are very timely, that can be implemented in the short run and targeted in ways that can help restore the economy quickly. Finally, let me talk about a few broader budgetary principles. One of them is that we live in a world of a great deal of uncertainty. We don't know when the pandemic is going to be fully under control. The vaccines, we were very successful in getting them. We've been, some places like Europe have been slow in getting them administered. US has changed dramatically after Trump was defeated and Biden has taken office. But in the light of that uncertainty about the pandemic and the economic aftermath of that uncertainty, programs, budgets ought to use automatic stabilizers. They ought to be contingent on the economic recovery. So things like furlough schemes, extended unemployment programs, and so forth ought to be linked to the economic recovery. Once the economic recovery occurs, they can automatically be phased out. But so long as the unemployment rate remains elevated, they should continue. And we've emphasized the importance of these automatic stabilizers. Biden hasn't done as much as he should have. It would be important to do that. The second thing is the risk of not doing enough are far greater than the risks of doing too much. That if it turns out that you do too much, there are instruments available. I talked about some tax measures. There are also a possibility of raising interest rates, moving from the zero interest rate environment to an environment with positive nominal real interest rates would actually be good for the financial markets, which have been very distorted by these low interest rates. So the broad point I want to raise is that there are broad budgetary principles that the pandemic has helped bring out. And as we think about designing budgets going forward, we really ought to incorporate these principles. And the final general principle, reflecting the particular circumstances that we're in right now, is that never has government spent so much money. And the government, much of that money is going to private sector, to companies. We ought to make that money conditional. And this, I'm to say we, both the United States, Europe, and UK, conditional on firms behaving in a responsible way, paying decent wages, having green, making sure their investments are green, airlines reducing their carbon footprint. So in return for the assistance that the public is giving them, they ought to be giving something back to society. And what we want them to give back is a closer congruence between the way they behave and what we mean by building back better, building a stronger future. So thank you for those remarks. Looking forward to questions.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, really grateful for that. If we bring Kate back in as well, we can then have some of the questions. That was really helpful, Joe. Kate, just on the questions that has come up, really, it's the Spirit Level was published in 2009, and inequality has increased, as you say. And this question says, we haven't seen much change. Do you see any signs of hope? And just for me to add to that, based upon your experience of some of the work you've been doing, what is the change we really want? What are those concrete steps that we could take to tackle the levels of inequality that we have?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Well, I always have hope. Otherwise, I'd give up, I suppose. But let me tell you what gives me hope. So there are certain demographic shifts, and one of the things that gives me hope is young people. So if we look at the voting patterns and the tendencies of young people, both in the UK and in the US, we are seeing a real change in the kinds of things that young people want. They're very progressive, and that gives me hope for the future. There was an analysis done, wasn't there, after the Brexit vote, that if only we'd had a referendum 1 year on, enough young people would have passed over the 18-year-old voting threshold who would have voted to remain, to have changed the result. And those demographic shifts are, we're seeing them in lots of different places. So young people give me hope. I feel quite a lot of hope at sort of the international level, and that's somewhere where Joe's operating quite a lot. We saw the establishment of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2013 with reducing inequalities as one of those 17 goals. Sometimes I'm really surprised by the radical progressiveness of the OECD or the IMF even these days in recognizing the need to tackle inequalities. So, you know, lots of good stuff going on there. And then locally, you know, I feel like, again, within the US, within the UK, you can see places where there's really positive local action, real commitment to tackling inequalities. Now, localities don't always have the levers and the power and the remit to do all the things that we need to do, but they can join together. They can use their sort of convening power, and they can pressurize national government to do better. So those things give me hope. I mean, we've seen, you know, in the UK, we've seen Scotland and Wales self-declare as well-being economies. You know, Wales has the future generations focus, and Scotland, it's an inclusive economy focus, but that's hugely positive. And, you know, in the work I've been doing in Greater Manchester, there's some incredibly good progressive work going on. It's just a question of how we scale that up and how we make sure that happens for everybody. And I suppose the two things that I think are really concretely needed are attention to how we redistribute wealth and give people access to assets and wealth building, creating opportunities within their communities, and how we democratize the economy to allow that to happen. So those are the things that give me hope.
Thanks. Joe, can I come back to you just to bring you in really into what's happening here and the debate from the budget, which a great deal of store was put by the Chancellor on the fact that, you know, we're borrowing additional 350 billion. Ratio of debt to GDP is 98%, something like that at the moment. And therefore, there's the fear that was injected into the debate was what happens if interest rates go up and we're having to pay so much more for the debt that we've incurred. And actually that line of argument was unchallenged in large sections of the media, certainly, and in many respects has taken hold. It's a bit like the original post-banking crash dominance, hegemony of the describing an economy like a household budget. And that's the issue that we've got to confront in this coming weeks in this debate, because I'm fearful that that will take hold and it will restrain us from taking some of the measures, particularly redistributive measures that Kate is advocating. What's your response on that?
Well, there are several points that I'd like to raise. First, one wants to look at the net, not gross debt to GDP. And much of the debt is held by the Bank of England, which is part of the government. And in the United States, much of the debt is being held by the Federal Reserve, which is part of the government. You know, everybody talks about Japan, their high debt GDP ratio, you know, 220%, but almost half, 40% or more, is held by the Bank of Japan. So the first point to observe is that these numbers don't reflect the reality of it's the net debt that matters. The second, you know, the one thing that you would be worried about, and people used to get worried about, was all this debt would lead to inflation. We haven't seen any inflation. In fact, some of what is going on, and you mentioned it in your remarks, is that there are deflationary pressures. People are cutting wages. Some of the details that we've seen on particularly lower wage workers is that wages are getting even lower. So the kind of worry that this is going to unleash an inflationary episode is not there. And as I said before, if any inkling of significant inflation, you could raise interest rates. So that's not a real worry. In terms of, is there a critical debt to GDP ratio above which growth slows? That's a question economists have spent a lot of time discussing over the last 5 years. There was a well-known paper by Rogoff and Reinhardt that said that there was a critical ratio. I think it was 80 or 90%. 90%. And it was demolished actually by a graduate student at UMass Amherst who just looked at the data and redid it and showed that they made a spreadsheet mistake. And then he did a more thorough analysis, causality. There were so many, I sometimes assign that paper as a class exercise to show what, how to do something better than, the kinds of things to be aware of in mistakes. But just to make the point more forcefully, at the end of World War II, we had 130% debt GDP ratio. UK was over 200%. The period after World War II was the fastest rate of growth that we've had, and it was shared prosperity. So all this boginess about, you get debt too high and it's the end of the world has no substance behind it. The final point is that because the interest rate is so low, the cost of servicing the debt is very low. Now, there's one grain of truth in the concern. You can't guarantee that interest rates are going to remain low forever. One of the things that the pandemic and the crisis of 2008 brought home is the deep uncertainty. One of the sets of models that have been led to a lot of macroeconomic problems are called these DSGE, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. This is maybe too much in the weeds, but those models assume away this deep uncertainty. They assume that there's a well-defined probability distribution. They've been a real source of bad policy advice. But the lesson of the implication of this deep uncertainty is you take action to protect yourself, to hedge that risk. And one way that you do that is to lengthen the maturity structure of the debt. And ironically, the United States has a very short maturity structure. As the interest rates have come down, we shortened the maturity structure. We should have gone the other way. So if you are worried about that risk, clearly the thing you ought to do is lock in these low interest rates, even if it costs you a little bit more to do so, but I'm sure it probably won't. But if it does, it's still worth the insurance policy to hedge that risk.
It's interesting because the debate is all around that at the moment in terms of whether or not this debt becomes unmanageable. And there's almost an installation of fear within the debate as a result of that, as though somehow, again, we have to resort back to, they won't use the word austerity, but in fact it is austerity that they're trying to inflict. So it becomes the ideological base upon which they can argue with regard to austerity. Actually, also, I have to say it's the ideological base upon which they argue for wage cuts as well, not just public sector wage freezes, but actually the way that then infects pay negotiations across the private sector too, again, fundamentally impacted upon by these fire and rehire policies that have developed in the recent period. It's very reminiscent of the 30s and what employers were doing then in terms of cutting wages and undermining working conditions. And as you say, at the same time, contradictorily, taking demand out of the economy, which makes this crisis even worse. One of the questions that's been put up, and I recognized who by, is Andrew Fisher, because he's been raising this in television interviews I've watched. He said, post the crash, the US had Roosevelt's New Deal, and post-war the UK had the Attlee government, which created the NHS and welfare state. Why are no governments thinking on that scale now? Either of you?
Well, I think in some ways, Biden is doing that. The $1.9 trillion is a big deal. And remember, that's only the first tranche. He wants to follow that up with a public investment program aimed at many of the things that you were talking about earlier: climate, inequality, a caring economy, changing the structure of our economy. So I think it's, and dealing with some of our deep-rooted problems like ingrained racial inequalities. So he's really, in our healthcare system to pick up, and our housing. So it's clear that on the agenda in the mind of the Democrats, both centrist and progressive, are these very big changes in our society. Now, it's being done in a more muted way because the United States democracy is one that is, to put it bluntly, very distorted. We have three branches of government, three parts. We have the House, where you have congressional districts that are gerrymandered. We have the Senate, where a small state like North Dakota has 2 senators, and the state of California and New York have 2 senators. So you have the same representation in the Senate for 20 million, 25 million people as you do for a few 100,000. And it's deeply undemocratic, and many of these small places are conservative and have engaged in a active program of disenfranchisement, which they now want to extend even further. So, and finally, we have a Supreme Court, and this was a problem during the New Deal. We have a Supreme Court that has entrenched very conservative philosophies that will have the potential of overruling anything that is done and declaring it unconstitutional. So that means that anybody trying to make those big changes needs to clothe them as evolutionary, as moving our society in ways that are broadly consensus. Now, here's what I agree very strongly with what Kate was saying. 2/3 of Americans support broadening health insurance, broadening access to education, increasing the minimum wage. Some of these are 80%. Access to housing. You go through the progressive agenda, it has support somewhere between 60% and 80%. So, and one of the reasons why the Republicans have been engaged in this active disenfranchisement program is that they know their agenda is a minority agenda. And the only way they can win is to make sure that the voting doesn't reflect the majority. It's a deeply undemocratic strategy, and I think I hope it doesn't win, because if it wins, it will have devastating effects on our society and our role of leadership in global democratic democracies. But I think that certainly has a force taming the you might say the more flourishing rhetoric that but the reality is that Biden does have a very strong agenda going forward.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, it'd be really interesting to see what he does going forward. I don't know what it is here, John. I mean, is it just a failure of imagination? Is it a failure of our ability to communicate a vision of how much better society could be? I mean, I remember, and you will remember very, very well, when some of Corbyn's policies were taken to conservative voters, and they were asked, what do you think of this idea? And they go, oh, that's a really good idea. What do you think of this policy? And they endorsed them all because they didn't know that they were his. and you actually go out and survey the British public, they will all agree that, we should do something about inequality, and we should address poverty and all of the other kinds of issues that bother us. But then somehow that all sort of trickles away, and we get, government after government failing to give us these revolutionary or large scale, ambitious changes of direction. It's disappointing, but I think all eyes are on Biden at the moment.
There's a multitude of explanations, of course, but so much research has been undertaken about all of this. But my relatively simplistic analysis of the recent period is that actually, if you look at up until 2017 with a very radical manifesto that was a simple message of anti-austerity, that gave us a door into a wider discussion about the individual policies, because people had had enough of austerity, and they'd vote for an administration that would end austerity. But that gave us permission then to say, these are the mechanisms that we can use, and actually we can go further than just a negativing of austerity. We can actually go much further and actually create something which gives us all a decent quality of life, and actually introduces an element, I have to say, an element of a bit of beauty into people's lives as well, because it was quite an extensive manifesto, environmentally, artistically, and in all of those issues. And I think that did excite people to a large extent. And also, it is an issue about the way in which communications work within our societies, because between 2015 and 17, it's the same as when Jeremy was elected leader. The media never really took us seriously. Therefore, the assault on the initial period on us, and on Jeremy in particular, the character assassination, was relatively weak at that stage. So we did still get a look in. We were still being battered by the media, the Murdoch press and others. We were still being battered, but we managed to get through to a certain extent. But also, at that stage, it was the first blossoming of social media as well. So we had a group of young people who were extremely creative on social media. And then also we did do the traditional on the stomp campaigning and reinvented word of mouth virtually as a form of political communication. So Jeremy would attract thousands to rallies and things like that. But then after 2017, three things happened. I think one is our opponents recognized that actually we were beginning to cut through. So the wave of assault on us was so much greater, and that the media really took us apart. I don't know how Jeremy survived the levels of abuse that he did, but that there was. Second thing is that actually they did catch up on social media. There's no doubt about it. The investment in social media was enormous. In fact, I was asking questions in Parliament today about the research about the way in which they got round the rules on expenditure on social media within the last election campaign. And then I think the third element as well is there's always that element of contingency in history, and the contingency for us was Brexit, basically, and that divided our support and party. So there were the elements of it. But I did think we did get close to that Attlee-type moment where after 10 years of austerity, people thought we've had enough. They looked back and wanted something different. And we got close to that, but ultimately failed. So there's lessons for the future. And I think the pandemic, despite what's happening at the moment, the pandemic has inspired an element of looking back and thinking we can do better than this, and there's the opportunity of trying to create something different. And that's why we brought the Claim the Future initiative together, to talk about that sort of society. At the moment, though, my fear is the water's closing over some of that ambition in the same way it did after the banking crash, when they start to hegemonize the debate and limit people's ambitions. And this fear of debt, etc., and the way in which the economy was portrayed yesterday actually did worry me, because I think they are beginning to, as I say, dominate this discussion. And that's why it's important we cut through that. And the reason it's important, Joe, for the way in which you intervene is to ensure that people realize that actually economies are there to be managed. You know, they're not in it. Human intervention in the economy can ensure that we can democratically control it at different stages of it and realize our ambitions. And the way it was debated in Parliament yesterday, it was though it was an animal force that no one could actually control whatsoever. And I think that's why it's important to ground our debates in a real discussion of political economy. And that's what we're trying to do. The other issue as well is to actually make people look towards a broader horizon than they've got at the moment. And I think there's the potential for that, but it does require an awful lot of discussion and an awful lot of exposure. I'm going on too much here. I just want to ask Kate, just on the equalities issues now, and the BAME community in particular. The pandemic is it's the point that Joe made as well. The pandemic has really exposed the real depth of inequality at every level, really, within our society, in terms of the BAME community in particular. What needs doing there now? What do we have to do to almost shake up this debate and move it on?
Oh, I think we really have to realize how deeply entrenched those ethnic inequalities are and how damaging they are. I mean, I think it was a real surprise to people. People were shocked, weren't they, when we started to see how much higher death rates were for Black Britons, for Asian Britons, for others from our diverse communities. It was almost as if they'd had blinkers on previously, and it took COVID to highlight the fact that people in those communities are more likely to be on low-paid work, that they can't avoid, they can't work from home, they've got to go out, they've got to keep exposing themselves to other people, because they're our key workers, and they're the ones keeping the factories and the shops going, and the care homes and all of that. So I think there had been a complete sort of, blinkers on, and not recognizing those pre-existing inequalities that COVID suddenly highlighted. And then once those blinkers are gone, you do start to see how historically those inequalities have come about, how much we failed to tackle them. And it's at all levels of society. I mean, I keep being on calls, at my university, Zoom calls with large numbers of people there. There are no Black or brown faces in the room. What are we doing to make sure that opportunities and assets and resources are there so that those communities are rising, so that those communities can engage? And why aren't we listening to their voices, and why aren't we hearing what they need? And for it to take a devastating global pandemic to really show us the level of inequalities existing in our society today, we should be ashamed, deeply ashamed, and we should be making huge amounts of effort to address those inequalities. It's a real wake-up call for us, I think.
One of the questions that's come up, which relates to that, and it's to you, Joe, as well, this comes up in all the discussions we have: why do governments not use quantitative easing to fund green interventions? Why does quantitative easing go to banks in order to provide liquidity and not to people to provide a basic income?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me give you I think a valid argument, and then say how you can get around it. The central banks do not feel they have any competency in allocating money among various borrowers. They only lend to government. Government's going to repay them. They make a big deal. We don't know how to assess risk. Beyond that, so we have a very simple task. which is difficult enough, which is macroeconomic adjustment. We don't want to get into the microeconomics of lending and credit assessment. Now, of course, to a large extent, they've done that. Both the ECB and the Federal Reserve did wind up buying commercial paper and buying debt from private firms. So they wound up doing it, but they felt intensely uncomfortable doing that. But the Federal Reserve, at least there is a widespread view that even under its current charter, could lend money to public authorities. And among the public authorities could be development banks, federal development banks, state development banks, and in particular, when I say development banks, I mean green development banks. And so they could lend to green banks, and the green banks would be banks that would be committed to lend for climate change. So that seems to me one of the uses by which one could actually use the power of the Federal Reserve and use it very effectively in increasing access to credit for shaping, for claiming the future, for building back better. And that's what I think that should be on the table of how you can direct more of the money to green infrastructure or green development banks.
One of the things that was widely bandied about yesterday was how much the Chancellor's proposals were taken from Labour's manifesto in 2017, 2019. And I think it was Andrew or others who said, well, it's rhetoric, not substance. And one of the elements was the establishment of an infrastructure bank that we put forward. But ours was a green infrastructure bank. And I think we'd capitalized over 20 billion, but then alongside that was a green transformation fund of 250 billion, which even at the time, actually, I thought was too little, but at least it was a good start. The governors capitalized their bank with 12 billion, I think it is. So it's nowhere. It's so insignificant. But the whole purpose of our National Investment Bank was to have regional development arms, which would be under local democratic control and planned at the local community level, so that there was not just a sense of ownership, but using the creative knowledge of local people, developing their alternative technologies, in particular, and alternative fuel sources. And again, in that way, we thought we'd actually be able to inspire a whole generation as we go forward. The problem that we had yesterday was this whole issue of lack of scale and lack of ambition. And it was very much, I think it's unpicked even more now. You just felt it was a sticking plaster despite all the rhetoric when you drilled down. It was so lacking ambition and mediocre. And you just think another lost opportunity, and we'll be back into the same old cycle within a limited period of time of unfortunately increasing poverty and lack of opportunity for people, but also, again, just some of these basic supplies of essential universal basic services being undermined. Housing crisis was continuing on. The health services surviving, but purely on the goodwill of the staff, and the social care is in crisis as well. It was just, you came away, despite all that, the opinion polls on today, I came away profoundly depressed about the whole lack of ambition about the thing. But again, I agree with Kate, really. You come out of the Westminster bubble, and actually there's so many people now campaigning and coming together through civil society on different matters. You know, the Renters Union campaigning now, not just for rent controls, but actually campaigning against landlordism itself, which is, you know, a real statement of commitment, really. Environmentalists have not gone away. They're campaigning in their local communities about biodiversity and developing local plans, etc. And the levels of engagement around, for example, the food banks and the way in which people have supported one another throughout the period. And I have to say also, one element of, people may not respect it as so, but one element of social solidarity is actually we have got a whole range of industrial action taking place at the moment against wage cuts and the way in which people have been treated by their employers as well. And although it's a form of solidarity that actually shouldn't have to happen, nevertheless, many people feel as they're being forced along that route. There's a whole range and host and comments here, some of which I'd better not repeat. They're not fit for general communication, particularly with regard to the point you raised, Kate, the distribution of some of the grant to particular areas. The Chancellor's own constituency or area of Richmond, possibly in some parts, some of the wealthiest part of the country, yet nevertheless receives a grant to level it up with the rest of the country, which is quite remarkable. And the same with regard to the distribution of government contracts. Joe, we've now got pork barrel politics in this country on a scale we've not seen before. And I know it's been a phenomenon in the past in America itself, but it does say something about the way in which our own politics has degenerated very much in recent years. Final question then is really from me. What's the one measure that if I'm going back into Parliament next week, Kate, what's the one measure that I should be raising on Monday in the budget debate that you think would have the maximum effect on tackling inequality?
Ooh, do you want an actual economic measure?
Any measure.
I think it would be around Green New Deal.
Yeah.
I think it's so much a win-win. You know, some of the problems that we've been hearing about in north of England around people's poor housing quality, people's lack of access to public transport, so many infrastructure issues that really need a green solution. You know, we need to be retrofitting houses so that they are not damp and vermin infested and cold in the winter. Those are green jobs and those are good jobs. And so if we invest in those, we're improving people's housing conditions. We're giving skilled work to people who are either entering the workforce or perhaps need to move from a different sector, you know, away from hospitality, say, or away from retail. And we're protecting our climate at the same time. So I'd be looking for things along the green lines.
Okay. Joe, one of the link to that, the issue that people have been raising with me as well, is global inequality and the way in which we should now be speaking. Now's not the time to go silent on that. Now's the time to actually be speaking louder. What measure would you argue for in terms of tackling global inequality?
Well, the two issues I would focus on is the special issuance of special drawing rights, IMF money, which, you know, the support measures, fiscal support measures that the UK, Europe, and the US have taken, the developing countries and emerging markets don't have the resources. They really don't have the resources. And in a few of the countries, the downturns have been much worse than the UK, Argentina about 12%. So the first issue is this is a relatively costless way of getting lots of money to countries that desperately need it. And the good news is that Secretary Yellen just a couple of days ago endorsed that U.S. had exercised its veto at the IMF, and that looks like it's reversing, and there will be that issuance. The second thing is debt relief. There are many poor countries, very poor countries, and emerging markets that have debts beyond their ability to repay. Private sectors, China, in many cases induced them to take out loans that were beyond their capacity to repay. Sometimes it was near the edge, but the pandemic put them over the edge. So now they can't repay. So the thing that we have to do is address this issue of sovereign debt. The UN in 2015 and 2014 endorsed the idea that there should be a framework for doing it. 2015, they endorsed a set of principles. Overwhelmingly, only about 6 countries voted against. Unfortunately, US and the UK were among the countries. So there is a well-understood set of principles that should guide this, and hopefully with a certain amount of compassion and self-interest, because we're not going to get a strong global recovery unless we get a recovery in most countries around the world. So the combination of self-interest and compassion should lead us to do both of the things that I suggested.
It puts into context the decision by our own Chancellor to cut the aid to Yemen last week, which was, to be honest, I think a disgrace. I want to thank you both. I'm really grateful for you both coming along and for your contributions. Kate and Joe, thank you very much. It's been enlightening and really encouraging as well. Thank you.
Thank you.